Rhythmic beeps pounded into Krista's ears as she found consciousness. She opened her eyes and squinted against the glare of bright lights. The beeping continued to her left. Every 2 seconds, the sound drummed in a slow, repetitive sequence. Krista blinked against the light as her eyes adjusted to the unfamiliar sights. A window took up the far wall, a typical New York City view of a gray sky fighting to be seen through a crowd of skyscrapers. The beeps came from a monitor by her bed as it kept perfect rhythm with her heart. Behind the monitor, a sea foam green curtain hung from the ceiling. It separated her bed from the other half of the room. A hospital? How long have I been here? Krista? A voice on the other side of her asked. Are you awake? Krista turned her head on the pillow and immediately regretted the sudden movement. A wave of pressure coursed through her skull like an overfilled water balloon ready to pop. She closed her eyes and cringed under the fresh, throbbing pain. When she opened them, she found her mother's anxious stare. Krista, do you want me to call the nurse? She heard the concern in her mother's voice. No, she groaned and slowly took a deep breath. She wanted to close her eyes and ease back to sleep. At least that had been painless. A nurse probably wouldn't help with that. What happened? Maybe she did need a nurse. It all depended on how bad the damage was. Then again, Krista didn't even know how or why she was here. If given the choice, she probably wouldn't have gone to the hospital. She hated hospitals. They were so cold. It reminded her of a morgue. The nurses always looked tired, and the patients gave her the creeps. How many sick people had laid in this bed before her? How many had died? Krista tried not to think about it. Her hand rose from under the white knit blanket. A wave formed in the fabric until her fingers freed themselves near her chest. She gently touched a spot behind her left ear. The slight stroke sent a new pain through her skull. Her fingers casually performed a quiet self-examination. The flesh on her cheek was swollen, a tenderness surrounded her left eye, and a bandage covered a small area on her temple. Her hand lowered to her chest. She opened her eyes and met the concern on her mother's face. Krista took a deep breath as she worked up the strength to speak. Hey, Mom. Brenda Lockhart stared at her with the same hazel eyes Krista saw when she looked in the mirror. Her mother had the benefit of age and a crease in her brow. She scrunched her forehead as she tried to mask the earlier look of worry with anger. Certainly, you have more to say than, hey, Mom. Krista closed her eyes against the headache threatening to take up residence. What happened? I'd hoped you'd tell me. The monitor's steady beeps covered the uncomfortable silence that settled between them. A loud scrape interrupted the rhythm as her mother scooted the chair closer to the bed. You have a fractured skull. You've been in a coma for 4 days. 4 days? A fractured skull? That explained the tenderness. Krista had yet to discover what had caused it. She swallowed and tried to ignore the fresh pain that came with it. She thought back to the last moments she could remember. The scene played in her mind like a vivid nightmare. She remembered being in the kitchen with her daughter. Krista had stood at the stove, ready to prepare lunch. To make it easier on their 3-year-old daughter, she had broken the spaghetti strands in half. Her husband, Christian, had walked in and they argued over the fact that he didn't want to eat like a child. She remembered turning away from the stove to confront him. It was only for a second, just long enough for her daughter to touch the hot pan. The anguished scream had caused her to switch her attention to provide comfort. The burn might have been bad enough to blister. The noise had irritated Christian. He threatened to give their daughter something to cry about. Krista recalled a flash of anger. She had snapped at his lack of sensitivity. He retaliated with his fists. She hit the floor. Then, Krista couldn't remember anything after that. Somehow, in their battle, she'd been knocked out, which left Christian alone with their daughter. Alexis? Krista asked. She prayed her husband, in his fit of anger, hadn't harmed their child. Alexis is fine. She's here. Where? Tammy is watching her so I can ask you some questions. Oh, here it comes, Krista thought grimly. Leave it to her mother to jump right to the point. Being in the hospital didn't merit even an ounce of sympathy. When Brenda Lockhart wanted answers, she wanted them now. No doubt her mother had sat at the bedside anxiously waiting for the first opportunity to start this little interrogation. We're going to start with the basics, her mother said. I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened. Don't start with the bullshit. You didn't fall down the stairs, run into a door, trip over your feet, fight off muggers, or get hit with a stray baseball. You weren't klutzy as a child. I seriously doubt it sprung on you in your 20s. Everything inside Krista clenched in a knot. Her stab of panic clearly showed on the monitor as the beeps came slightly faster. It was hard enough to come up with reasons for bruises and scratches, but she would need to have a damn good reason for being hospitalized with a significant head injury. When can I go home? That's a delightful way to change the subject, Brenda said. Do you remember what happened? Some of it, Krista admitted. Her mother was on to something. She wanted to collect more colorful details to complete the picture she had already painted in her mind. As Krista met those all too familiar hazel eyes, she didn't see a reason to lie. However, she didn't want to spill the truth either. She wanted to avoid the topic rather than contrive a story her mother would poke a bunch of holes in. Krista looked away from her mother's sharp gaze and cringed with fresh pain. I think I fell down the stairs. How? I don't want to talk about it. I'm afraid that's not an option. The detective asked me to call him when you woke up. Why do I need to talk to a detective? You called the police. No, your neighbors did. That's what started the investigation. The monitor beeps quickened. What investigation? Brenda closed her eyes. Look, I know you have every excuse in the world about why you keep getting hurt, but that's not going to work this time. You're going to need a convincing excuse to explain this severe set of new bruises. Krista remained silent. The scene in the kitchen held a vivid memory, along with the other times she'd fallen. Fine, I'll get you started, her mother said. She would continue with or without Krista's approval. Christian also used the excuse that you fell down the stairs. That sounds about right, Krista agreed in a dry, emotionless tone. It was a shame they were both able to provide the same cover story without consulting each other. She blinked back tears as she focused on the fluorescent lighting. At least she didn't have to worry about retaliation from mismatched stories. Brenda grunted a disbelieving huff. You know what's funny? Krista was in no mood for jokes. Out of the 3 people in your family, the 3-year-old is more honest than either of her parents. Krista closed her eyes. Alexis had been there. She had seen everything. Kids, whether they meant to or not, tended to be painfully honest. Your father and I asked Lexi what happened to you. Brenda leaned closer to the bed. Do you know what she said? Krista bit her bottom lip when tears threatened to fall. She was pretty open about the fact that her father did this to you. Her voice was filled with regret. Warm fingers wrapped around the back of Krista's hand. This stops right now. Alexis should not live in that environment, and you shouldn't have let it continue to this point. Concern inched back into Brenda's voice, but the tone remained hard as steel. Krista's hand balled into a fist under her mother's fingers. Hot tears streamed from the corners of her eyes, and the throbbing in the back of her skull only intensified. It was one thing to know her living situation was a train wreck, but to openly admit she had let her marriage get this far out of control made her want to crawl into the fetal position and bawl like a child. Krista tried to hold back her emotions with a quick sniffle. She didn't need to confirm what Alexis had already confessed. She didn't want to talk about Christian or the things he'd done to her. She couldn't admit to her mother that she woke up every morning scared for her life. Krista didn't need to. Brenda already knew. Brenda's voice broke when she started to speak. She cleared her throat and tried again. Well, when your father found out, he wasn't happy about the news. I mean, we suspected, but... Krista caught a clump of sheet and used it to dab at her eyes and cheeks. She flinched as she touched a sore spot. Dad's here? Where is he? He's not here, Brenda answered quickly. Krista slowly turned her head on the pillow. She eased the gentle movement with care. Where is he? After we talked to Lexi, he left. Where did he go? Why haven't you called the police? Was her mother trying to change the subject? I don't know. I guess I thought I could fix it. Where's Dad? Brenda ignored the question. Fix it? How? Problems like this don't just go away. I know, Krista said with a deflated breath. Do you realize he could have killed you? The thought had occurred to her. Waking in a hospital certainly hadn't put her mind at ease. Krista still didn't want to talk about the things Christian had done to her. She tried to bring the conversation back to the answers she wanted. Krista needed to know why her mother avoided questions about her father. Where's Dad? He left. When? Why? When is he coming back? Her father was well aware of the rocky relationship between Krista and her mother. Why would he leave her to wake up alone to this awful line of questions? Joseph Lockhart acted as the buffer in these situations. Krista closed her eyes to ward off a new wave of throbbing. She wanted answers, and she wouldn't give up until she had them. When did he leave? She asked. 4 days ago, when this happened. Please tell me he didn't. He did. He wanted to confront your husband. He was as tired of this as I am. I'm sorry, Krista, but this was the last straw. We refuse to watch these acts continue. Krista tried to sit up and cringed as a new wave of pain swam through her head. She closed her eyes. He can't do that, she groaned. Brenda lowered her voice. He already did. It's not his problem or yours. It wasn't much, but it was all she could manage as she fought the pain pounding through her skull. Krista knew that if her father, a seasoned bank executive, had gone after a man like Christian, the odds were left a little lopsided. Brenda's image blurred. Krista, are you okay? She heard the question and didn't know the answer. Krista willed her head to stop hurting. She tried to cover the rush of fear with anger. Her parents didn't understand Christian. This was her problem, her marriage, and she would handle it. Another voice entered the room. Mommy, you're up. The tiny, excited voice stole Krista's attention. She turned and focused on her daughter's face. Hi, baby. Krista clumsily reached away from the bed to ruffle the top of her daughter's dirty blonde hair, a color she inherited from her father. How's your hand? Are you feeling better? Uh-huh. Alexis nodded and displayed her bandages. 3 fingers on her right hand had the tips protectively covered in pink Hello Kitty Band-Aids. Brenda reached for the little girl as she sent her sister in the doorway a questioning look. It was obvious the interrogation wasn't quite finished. Krista didn't mind. She welcomed the distraction. Innocent, wide eyes met Krista's as her child's tiny frame climbed onto a chair and leaned onto the hospital mattress. Alexis's uninjured hand reached for the bruise beside her mother's eye. You better, Mommy. Krista caught her hand and pulled her daughter onto the bed to sit on her lap. She slowly wrapped her arms around Alexis and held her tight. I'm fine, baby, she answered, not entirely sure if it was the truth. Sitting here on this uncomfortably stiff hospital bed, part of her realized it couldn't be a complete lie. The most important person in her life was in her arms, safe from Christian. Alexis wiggled against her mother's chest, her fingers tangled in the cord tracking Krista's pulse. Mommy, we going home? Brenda? The urgency in Aunt Tammy's soft-spoken voice carried throughout the room like she had struck a gong. Brenda twisted. What is it? Tammy held Brenda's eyes. The detective is here. You called him? Krista asked her aunt. No, the nurse called the station when you woke up. It is their procedure. Krista sighed as she tapped her fingers against Alexis's leg. She was afraid something like this would happen. Tammy shifted her eyes to the hall. He wants to talk to Krista. Brenda stood. Okay, but I want to talk to him first. Her mother walked around the bed and left the room. Krista locked eyes with her mother's sister. What happened? Tammy's brow scrunched and her voice softened. I'm sure the detective will explain everything.